one of the big things that I kind of landed into some years ago was I was working for Disney and I was trying to break down what made some of the movies visually successful and others not. So I went into the archives and I had a couple of weeks to go in and just look for notes, and I looked at all the artwork from these different movies. I actually went to a handful of my peers and I asked them, what do you feel is the most successful animated films visually? And I got a short list. Everybody had their favorites. Stylistically, they were different, like Bambi and 101 Dalmatians are very different, Sleeping Beauty and so on. Anyway, there was, and Peter Pan, there was about 5 or 6 movies that everybody felt were successful visually, but they looked very different. So I was trying to figure out, what did they do on those movies that made them successful? Even though they looked different. Was there something in the notes? Was there a way that they managed communication? What is it that they actually did that really communicated to the artist and created continuity and a completely different look? And I couldn't find any specific information that was consistent. Some were driven, like Sleeping Beauty. Ivan Earl was just so prolific. He just did so many visual sketches and comps and then painted over everybody's work as they finished their background painting. So it was pretty much, you got the same hands working and overworking on everything. It didn't make some of the artists very happy that their work was getting redone or overdone, but every show was a little bit different. Tyrus Wong on Bambi, he brought certain characteristics to the visuals in that movie that, they actually implemented the backgrounds on that movie. They were done in pastel, watercolor, oil paintings, and you'd never know the difference. I mean, they were all merged together in the final look. But the actual artwork varied in size and medium and everything. So it was really kind of interesting. I started reading, other people, Bridgman, Robert Beverly Hale, and other, more classic artists and training, things like that. And I remember Bridgman started out and Hale started out saying there's 3 principal ways of drawing. And then from there they diverged. But they both said, and there was more books that concluded too, or alluded to the idea there's 3 ways of drawing. So I started reading more about that and realizing that they were describing things a little differently. And that's what was confusing. It was confusing to artists. Like, you read one and the terms they use, like mass, even in the Bridgman book, he uses the term mass in 2 or 3 different ways. So how do you keep track of that? And some other books that were more atelier style things did the same thing. It was like, the terms they were using the same terms and it was crossing over and getting confusing. So that's where I was kind of looking at it and thinking, this, what's the real reason? What is the real, kind of thing? So when I tried to find what appeared to be the most concrete, distinctive, describable, unique 3 different modes of working, all of a sudden it just became real clear. And those different movies, the thing that made them successful was that each of them, they picked one of those components or one of those ways of working and made that principle. And they solved all of their visual problems, because you're always you're storytelling and you've got all these emotions and you're always trying to come up with different ways. They didn't go to a default something else. They always answered their visual problems along leaning into the same component, okay? It came down to line, or the description of line, marks that sit on the surface. And marks that sit on the surface could also be considered texture. So line and texture was one of the components. Mass, or flat values, flat shapes, local values, that was another one. And then the handling of form, light and shadow, that was the third one. And if you pick one and you make that your default, your main theme, okay, you can use one of the other 2 as a support, okay, and then ditch the third. It gives you clarity. Now, there's many ways to do all different styles, but there's one sure way to make garbage, and that is be unclear about what direction you have there. If line, mass, and form have equal balance in your image, you can write it off. It's not gonna work. That's pretty much what it is. It's a lack of a commitment to one of those directions. And all of us have our own personal, let's just say, recipe for the way we manage those three components. So we're all different. We all bend into different styles and stuff, or have affinity to different styles. And so we all have our own little code of working this. And that's why I think it's really, really important to become aware of that. What is your personal bias? Because then I know when you're working collectively with a number of artists and you have to get the same look, you know what you have to change in yourself to move outside your comfort zone. Or you become aware of what is it that makes your comfort zone, and you can put a name to it. And when you can do that, you can either own it or look at it as a habit that you might want to change. So it kind of brings it down to a workable situation. And I think that was the situation that, like I said, George Bridgman and Robert Beverly Hale and some of these other artists, they understand that, they work with that, but it's not always described the same way. And that's for us who pick up different books or look at different instruction. Instructors might not use the same terms, it might be meaning the same thing, but not using the same terms, and sometimes that can become confusing. So that's my little synopsis on that. It can get kind of confusing. So not that we won't be going into that a whole lot of, I was just kind of getting into that just as an introduction. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, okay? It wasn't the main topic of this class, but it is something that we'll definitely discuss, because it has everything to do with the way you put marks on a paper. And that is going to be part of what we're going to talk about. But just to kind of go over briefly what the session is going to be in the next 8 weeks, I'm going to talk about visual storytelling.